Chapter 31. Parentiania Street, Honolulu, 30 October, 4:30 p.m. It's strange, Dorothy Gert, senior forensic scientist with the Honolulu Police Department, kept her eyes focused on the eyepieces of a Zeiss binocular microscope. I've never seen anything like it. She stood up, and Dan Watanabe sat down at the microscope. They were in an open area subdivided by lab benches. The benches were stocked with testing equipment, imaging equipment, microscopes, computers. He adjusted the eyepieces and focused. At first he saw a small object with a metallic look. How big is it? He asked. 1 millimeter. It was somewhat larger than a poppy seed, but it was a machine, or looked like one. What the hell, he said. My feeling too. Where'd it come from? Fong's office, Dorothy Gert said. The evidence team dusted the office for prints. They lifted the object on a print tape from a window near the lock. Watanabe changed the focus and moved his gaze up and down the object. It was damaged. It appeared to be crushed, and was covered with a dark, tar-like material. The object vaguely resembled a vacuum cleaner, except that it had something that looks like a fan on it. Fan blades inside a housing? A little bit like a jet engine. There was a long, flexible neck, a gooseneck, and at the end of the neck, 2 sharp, flat metal pieces stuck out. It must have fallen out of somebody's computer, he said. Dorothy Gert was standing next to him, leaning on the lab bench. She straightened up. Does a computer have knives in it? She said quietly. He looked again. What he had thought were 2 flat pieces of metal coming off the gooseneck now looked more like blades. Crossed daggers, gleaming at the end of a flexible arm. Do you think, he began. I want to know what you think, Dan. Watanabe turned the zoom knob. He went down into the view, deeper and deeper, magnifying the daggers. They became precision instruments, forged and polished. Each blade reminded him of a tanto, a Japanese dagger used by samurai. There was some kind of dark, dirty material smeared on the blades. And then he saw the cells. Dried red blood cells. The cells were mixed with fibrin. There's blood on it, he said. I had noticed. How long are those blades? Less than 0.5 millimeter, Gert answered. Then it doesn't work, he said. The victims bled to death from cuts up to 2 centimeters deep. The cuts opened their jugulars. These blades are far too small to cut somebody's throat. It's like trying to kill a whale with a penknife. Can't do it. They both were silent for a moment. Except at birthdays, Watanabe added. Excuse me, Dan? You're wrapping a birthday present. You cut the paper with scissors. Those blades are scissors, he said. They could have snipped large wounds in the victims. He began scanning the device, searching for identifying marks. A serial number, a printed word, a corporate logo. He found nothing of the sort. Whoever had built the device had not put on identifying marks, or had carefully erased them. In other words, whoever had made the device didn't want it to be traced. He said, "Did the autopsies turn up any more of these devices in the wounds, in the blood?" "No," Gut said, "but the examiners probably wouldn't have noticed them." "What's the status of the bodies?" "Fong was cremated. Rodriguez got buried. John Doe is in the fridge. He needs a second look." "Will do." Watanabe stood back from the microscope and put his hands in his pockets and began to walk up and down the lab. He frowned. Why was the device found on a window? If it came out of a body, how did it get to the window? How did it get into the body in the first place? He returned to the microscope and studied the little device's fan-like housing. Well, it was a propeller. My gosh, this thing could fly, Dorothy. That's speculative, Dorothy Gut said dryly. It could swim in blood, possibly. Can you recover DNA from the blood that's stuck on the device? A prime smile. I can get DNA from a flea's sneeze, Dan. I'd like to see if the blood on the device matches any of the victim's blood. That would be interesting, Dorothy Gut said, her cynical eyes brightening a little. They make small robots, he murmured. What, Dan? He stood up. Nice work, Dorothy. Dorothy Gut gave Lieutenant Watanabe a faint smile. Hardly a smile at all. What did the lieutenant think she did with her time in the forensics lab, other than nice work? With exquisite care, she picked up the tiny object with a pair of tweezers and lowered it into a plastic vial smaller than her pinky, and carried the vial into the evidence locker area. After all, she could be handling a murder weapon. Watanabe went out thinking. Nanogen. Small robots. Now these seem to be a link between the really Fong mess and Nanogen. Time to have a chat with the CEO. Vin Drake had dropped by the communications center. He had kicked the young woman operator out of the room and locked the door, and had taken over the pinger himself. Now he gazed into the screen that displayed a three-dimensional terrain map of the northwest cliffs of Manoa Valley, from the valley's bottom to the structure of Tantalus Crater. 2,000 feet above, near the top of Tantalus Cliffs, at the base of the crater, he saw a circle with crosshairs over it. This showed the approximate location of the stolen hexapod. The survivors, he could see, had made it nearly to the lower slopes of Tantalus Crater. At the rate they were climbing, they would reach Tantalus Base maybe by tomorrow morning, unless a predator got them. He couldn't control the predators. What he could control was Tantalus Base. Sitting in the communications room, Drake got out his encrypted corporate phone and called Don Michele. The hexapod is getting close. Chapter 32, Tantalus Cliffs, 31 October, 9:45 a.m. The truck climbed up over a lip of rocks and emerged into a pocket of mossy ground. A small pond gleamed, and a miniature waterfall dribbled into the pond. As the drops landed in the water, they made the water shimmer with prismatic flashes. Rick, Karen, and Erica climbed down from the truck. They stood by the pool, gazing into it. It was crystal clear, with a mirror-like surface. "We are so dirty," Erica said. "I could use a swim," Karen said. They saw their reflections in the water. They were tired-looking and sweaty, and their clothing had become ragged and grimy. Karen knelt and touched the water. Her finger dented the water, but didn't break it. She was touching the meniscus, the rubbery surface of the water. She pushed against the meniscus, putting her weight into it, and her hand broke through the surface. "It's so tempting," she said. "Don't do it. You'll be killed," Danny said from the truck. "There's nothing dangerous here, Danny," Karen said. Rick wasn't so sure. He took the harpoon and probed it around in the pool, jabbing it into the bottom and stirring the water. If any nasty creatures lived in the pool, he hoped the disturbance would lure it out. The water flickered, with single-celled organisms drifting and corkscrewing, but none of these little creatures seemed dangerous. The pool was small and shallow enough that they could see all of it. Nothing seemed threatening. "I'm going for a swim," Erica said. "I'm not," Danny said. Rick and Karen glanced at each other. Erica went off behind a clump of moss and returned naked. "Is there a problem?" she said to the others. While Danny stared. "We're all biologists here." She stepped onto the surface of the pool. The water dimpled under her toes, but it supported her weight, didn't break it. She pressed down harder, and suddenly she broke through and went in up to her neck. She waded over to the waterfall and stood under it. The droplets tumbled down, bursting on her head and making her gasp. "It's magnificent. Come in." Karen began to take off her clothes in a matter-of-fact way. Rick wasn't sure what to do. He felt embarrassed to be looking at Karen while she undressed, more embarrassed to be swimming with her and Erica naked. He got his clothes off fast and jumped into the water. "Welcome to Eden," Erica said. "A dangerous Eden." Rick ducked down and began scrubbing his head. As Karen explored the pool, she saw it was like a fish tank, full of living things. But they weren't fish. They were single-celled organisms. The creatures spun and darted and drifted. A torpedo-shaped creature swam up against her. It was a paramecium, a pond-water animal, a protozoan consisting of a single cell. The paramecium was covered with rippling hairs that propelled the creature through the water. It began bumping along Karen's arm, tickling her skin. She cupped her hands and picked up the paramecium. Holding it in a handful of water, she could feel the hairs beating on her palms, and the cell squirmed. It reminded her of a cat that didn't like being held. "I won't hurt you," she said to the cell, stroking it gently with a fingertip. As she touched the hairs, they reacted by reversing direction, beating against her finger. It was like stroking velvet that fought back. Why am I talking to a cell? Karen thought. That's pretty silly. A cell is a machine, she told herself. It's just a clockwork of proteins inside a water-filled bag. And yet, she couldn't help feeling that the cell was also a small being, full of its own purposes and desires. A cell wasn't intelligent the way a human is, of course. A cell couldn't imagine galaxies or compose a symphony. Yet it was a sophisticated biological system, perfectly adapted to survive in this environment, and bent on making copies of itself, as many as possible. "Good luck," she said out loud, opening her hands and letting the cell go free. She watched it hurry away, corkscrewing as it swam. She said to Rick, "We're not so different from these protozoa." "I don't see the resemblance," Rick said. "A person is a protozoan on the day the person is conceived. As the biologist John Tyler Bonner likes to say, a human being is a single-celled organism with a complicated fruiting body." Rick grinned. "The fruiting body is the best part." "Crude," Karen remarked. Erica smirked at him. A shadow crossed the pool, and a scream echoed above. Instinctively, they ducked their heads under the water. When they came up, Rick looked around and said, "Birds." "What kind?" Karen said. "No idea. They're gone anyway." They washed the clothes in the pool, rinsing the dust and mud out. Afterward, they spread the clothes to dry and sunbathed for a little while on the moss. The clothes dried quickly. "We need to get going," Ricardo said, buttoning his shirt. Just then, the distant cries grew louder, and dark shapes flashed through the air above them. The humans leaped to their feet. A flock of birds was cruising along the cliffs, landing and taking off. The birds were foraging. Their cries shattered the air. A bird landed before them. It was enormous, with shiny black feathers, a yellow bill, and an alert gaze. It hopped around, investigating the spot, and screamed, a raspy, echoing cry. And then suddenly it took off. More birds arrived overhead, and they began circling, inspecting the scene, and landing in trees that clung to the cliff face. The humans became aware of many eyes watching them. The cries of the birds surrounded the pool. Rick dashed for the truck, grabbed the gas rifle. "They're minehas," he shouted. "Get cover." Minehas were carnivores. Denny had tumbled out of the truck, and he cowered underneath it. Karen had thrown herself down behind a rock, while Erica wedged herself down into clumps of moss. Rick knelt in the open, holding the gas rifle, watching the black shapes as they swept past the cliffs, their cries steaming in the wind. The birds saw him. They had no fear of something so small. A myna cruised in and landed and hopped across the ground toward him. He fired at the bird. The gun erupted with a hiss, kicking him backward, but at that instant the myna leaped into the air and soared away, downwind. He had missed. He reloaded frantically, slamming another pin into the chamber. The gun was a bolt-action rifle. It fired one projectile at a time. He thought there must be 20 or 30 of them. Anyway, they swirled around the cliffs, their cries deafening. They hunt in packs, Rick said. Another myna landed. He pulled the trigger. Nothing happened. Shit. A jam. He frantically rocked the bolt. The bird took one hop toward him and cocked an eye at him. Then it pecked at him and grabbed the gun. It was a shiny object. It had attracted the bird's eye. The myna slammed the gun against the rock, crumpling it and tossed it aside. Then it held up its head, opening its beak, and howled, letting out a cry that seemed to make the ground shake. Rick, meanwhile, had thrown himself flat and was crawling for the harpoon, which lay near the pool. The myna had turned its attention to Erica, who cowered in the moss. She crouched, staring up at the bird, and suddenly lost her nerve. She broke and ran, ducking her head, whimpering. "Don't, Erica," Rick shouted at her. Erica's motions drew the bird's attention, and it hopped towards her. Henry King had been watching, and she made a sudden decision. She would sacrifice her life for Erica. She would give Erica a chance to live. It was good while it lasted, she thought, and stood up and ran toward the bird, waving her arms. "Hey, take me!" The bird swerved and pecked at Karen, but missed her, and she went sprawling. Erica had now jumped into the truck and was attempting to start it. Erica had gone into a full-blown panic. She didn't know what she was doing, other than trying to get away. Danny shouted at her, "Stop! I order you to stop!" Erica paid no attention. The truck lurched off and began climbing upward along the rocks. But it was very exposed. She was deserting the others. "Erica, turn around!" Karen screamed. Erica had gone past the point of hearing anybody. The truck, shiny and moving up the cliff, its 6 legs working, must have seemed like something tasty or interesting. A myna coasted in and plucked Erica out of the driver's seat. Packs and gear flew out of the truck as it tumbled down the cliff and bounced out into sheer air. And then it was gone. The myna landed, carrying Erica Mole in its beak. The bird slammed her several times against the cliff, ripping its head back and forth to kill its prey. The bird then took off, carrying the corpse. Immediately, it got into a squabble with another myna, and they fought with each other over the remains of Erica Mole, and tore the body apart in mid-air. It wasn't over. Rick had gotten his hands on the harpoon, and he looked around. Where was Karen? She was lying on the ground, out in the open, underneath a myna. The bird, which had an unusual black streak on its bill, had landed and was staring down at Karen. It seemed to be trying to make it up its mind about her. Was this thing edible? Karen, Rick shouted, and threw the harpoon at the bird. The harpoon, a thread of metal, went into the bird's feathers. Not very far. The bird shook itself, and the harpoon dropped to the ground. The bird studied Karen. She crouched, trying to make herself look small and unappetizing. Over here, Rick shouted, and started running, hoping to distract the bird. No, Rick. The myna cocked its eye at Karen when she spoke. It lunged for her and picked her up in its beak, threw its head back and swallowed Karen in one gulp. Then it flew off, wings thundering. Damn you, Rick yelled at the myna. He waved the harpoon at the bird, which had become a fluttering speck in the distance. Come back with her. The flock in the trees chattered and roared. Now he couldn't tell which of them had eaten Karen. Come back for a fair fight. He jumped up and down, waving his arms, shaking the harpoon. He felt like crying. He would have done anything to get the myna bird to come back. The one with a streak on its bill. He couldn't give up now. But then he remembered something he'd learned about birds. A bird does not have a stomach. It has a crop. Chapter 33. Edge of Tantalus. 31 October, 10:15 a.m. Karen King was curled up in a fetal position inside the crop of the myna bird, holding her breath. The muscular walls of the crop pressed in on her, clamping her in place so that she couldn't move. The walls were slimy, slick, and smelled foul. However, there were no digestive juices in the crop. It was simply a bag for storing food, before the food was passed down into the rest of the digestive system. She knew the bird was flying, because she felt the regular thump-thump of the bird's pectoral muscles, driving its wings. She got her arms around her face and pushed outward, and managed to open a space for her nose and mouth. She took a breath. The air smelled horrible, with an acid stench of rotting insects. But at least it was air. Not much air, though. Almost immediately, it became stifling hot and she began to pant. A wave of claustrophobia came over her. She wanted to scream. With an act of will, she tried to calm herself. If she began to scream and struggle, she would use up the air quickly and would suffocate. The only way to stay alive was to stay calm. moved sparingly, and tried to make the air last as long as possible. She straightened her spine and pushed her legs out. This stretched the crop and opened up a little more space. Even so, she was running out of air. She tried to get her knife in her hand, but she'd tucked it down deep in her hip pocket. She couldn't reach the knife. The muscular walls of the bird's crop held her arm back. Damn. Gotta get that knife. Right then, she vowed to hang her knife around her neck in the future. If there was a future, she drove her right arm downward, fighting against the rubbery walls that surrounded her. She forced her fingertips into the pocket and let her breath out with a whoosh, gulped in nasty air, and coughed. Her fingertips closed on a bottle in her pocket. What was this? It was the spray bottle, filled with beetle spray. Rick had filled it. A weapon? She grimaced and dragged the bottle out. At that moment, the bird maneuvered in flight. The crop tightened, the muscles squeezing the breath out of her lungs with a whoosh. A sensation of weightlessness came over her, a sense of falling. Then came a lurch and a bump. The bird had landed. She lost consciousness. The miner had returned to the same spot where it had caught Karen, looking for more food. It stared at Ricardo, cocking its head. Rick recognized the black streak on its bill. The same bird. It had eaten Karen. No way of knowing if she was still alive. But she might be. He waved the harpoon in front of him and advanced toward the bird. Come and get me, you cowardly bastard. The Maasai thrust. That was what he had to do to this bird. A young Maasai warrior, a boy of 13 or 14, can kill a lion with a spear. It's doable, he told himself. It's all about technique. The bird hopped toward him. He watched, judging the distance, timing his move, planning what he would do with his body. The angle of the harpoon. He would have to use the animal's own strength and weight against itself, as Maasai hunters do with lions. The Maasai hunter provokes the lion to charge him, and at the last instant, he plants the butt of his spear in the ground, with the point angled towards the lion, and he kneels behind the spear. The lion runs onto the spear and impales itself. The bird struck at him with its beak. As the strike came, Rick jammed the harpoon's butt at an angle into the ground, with the point aimed upward at the bird. He took his hand off the harpoon and threw himself forward, diving under the bird's chest to get out of the way. The harpoon caught the bird in the neck as the bird pecked down at Rick, with a bob tip honed to greater finesse than a surgical needle, and drenched with poison. The weapon pierced the bird's neck, breaking through the skin, and the bob stuck there. The bird backed off with a harpoon dangling from its neck. It shook its head, trying to dislodge the harpoon, while Rick crawled away. He sat up and drew his machete. "Come on, fight," he shouted at the bird. Karen heard Rick's voice. It brought her to her senses. She had passed out momentarily. She started hyperventilating, drawing air into her lungs, but she couldn't get enough to breathe. Prickles of light flashed in her eyes, a sign of oxygen starvation. She became aware of the spray bottle, clutched in her fist. She pulled the trigger and felt a horrible burning sensation as the chemicals surged out and spread around her. The muscle squeezed tighter, and the stars turned into fog, and then into nothing. The miner wasn't happy. The harpoon had pricked it, and there were unpleasant sensations in its crop. It vomited. Kenna King landed in the moss, and the bird took off. She was unconscious. Rick knelt by Karen and felt her neck for a pulse, and discovered that her heart was still beating. He placed his mouth on hers and drove a breath into her lungs. With a rasping sound, she took a breath on her own. She coughed, and her eyes opened. "Oh, keep breathing, Karen. You're okay." She still gripped the spray bottle. Her hand was locked around it. Rick pried her hand open and released the bottle. Then he dragged her under a fern. There he helped her to sit up, and then he cradled her in his arms. "Take deep breaths," he said. He pulled a strand of hair off Karen's face and smoothed her hair. He didn't know where the birds were, whether they were still hunting in the area or had moved on, but their screams had grown more distant. He propped Karen against a stem and sat beside her, drawing his knees up. He kept his arms around her. "Thank you, Rick. Are you injured?" "Just a little dizzy." "You weren't breathing. I thought you were." The cries of the birds faded. The flock had moved on. Rick made a more quick survey of their remaining gear. Their survival was in real jeopardy. The truck was gone. Erica dead. Most of their supplies had gone over the cliff with the truck. The harpoon was gone as well, for the miner had flown off with a barb still lodged in its neck. The backpack lay near the pool. They still had the blowgun and the car. A single machete lay on the ground. Danny Manat was nowhere to be seen. But then they heard his voice coming from above. In his panic, he had climbed up a vine and had come out at the top of the rock. They saw him crouched up there, waving his good arm. "I see the great boulder. We're almost there." Chapter 34. Nanajan, 31 October, 10:20 a.m. Drake had taken over the communications room. He was staring at the screen of the remote tracking system that had been pinging the hexapod truck. Right now, he was a little puzzled by what he saw on the screen. The crosshairs on the cliff face indicating the approximate position of the truck had suddenly shifted downward by 150 meters, by about 500 feet. At first he suspected a system error, but as he watched and waited, the truck's location didn't change. It wasn't moving. He allowed himself a modest smile. Yes, it looked like the damn truck had fallen off the cliff. That had to be it. The truck had plunged down the cliff face. He knew that a micro-sized human body could survive any fall, any distance. But the fact that the truck wasn't moving meant that, at the very least, the truck had been damaged. It might be busted. The survivors would be in a total panic by now, he realized. They weren't getting any closer to Tantalus. And the bends would be just starting to affect them. They would not be feeling exactly chipper. He got Michele on his phone. Have you been to Tantalus? Yes. And? I didn't do anything. Didn't need to. They're not going to make Tantalus anyway. They took a tumble. Poor souls. Chapter 35. Kalakimaki Industrial Park, 31 October, 10:30 a.m. Lieutenant Dan Watanabe parked his brown Ford in the single, lone parking space marked Visitors. The painted metal building stood next to the skeleton of a half-finished warehouse on one side and an empty lot on the other side, dotted with thickets of underbrush. By the warehouse, he noticed an area covered with gravel. He walked over to it and picked up a few pieces. Crushed limestone. Interesting. It looked like the same stuff trapped in the P.I. Rodriguez's tires. He dropped a few pieces in his shirt pocket for Dorothy Gutt to have a look at. The parking lot around Nandajan's building was full of cars. How's business? He said to the receptionist. They don't tell me much. A coffee maker on a table diffused the sour smell of coffee that had been heating for hours. Would you like me to make some coffee? The receptionist asked. I think you already did. The company's security chief walked in. Don Michele was a heavy-set man, packed with muscles. Michele said, Any news on the missing students? Could we talk in your office? As they entered the main part of the building, they passed doors that were shut. Windows looked into rooms, but the windows were covered with black blinds on the inside. Why were their blinds all drawn? Why were they black? As he walked along, Dan Watanabe felt the presence of a hum, a vibration coming up through the floor. That hum meant there was a lot of AC electrical current running in the building. For what? Michele ushered Watanabe into his office. Windowless. Watanabe noticed a photograph of a woman. Must be the guy's wife. 2 children. Just KKs. He noticed a plaque on the wall. U.S. Marine Corps. Watanabe sat on the chair. Nice kids. I love 'em to death, Michele said. You served in the Marines? Intel. That's cool. Chit-chat never hurts. And you can pick up things. We found your Vice President, Alison Bender, he began. We know. She was very depressed. What got her depressed? She'd lost her boyfriend, Eric Jansen, who drowned. So, Miss Bender and Mr. Jansen were romantically connected, I take it, Watanabe said. He could feel the uneasiness of the man under the surface. Cop instinct. He went on. It's actually pretty hard for 7 people to vanish in these islands. I've called around to see if the students showed up anywhere. Like Molokai. Everybody on Molokai knows everybody else on Molokai. If 7 kids from Massachusetts showed up there, the Molokai folks would be talking about it. Don't I know? I was born on Molokai, Michele said. Watanabe noticed that he pronounced the name of the island in the old way, Molokai, with a glottal stop. It made him wonder if Michele spoke any Hawaiian. People born on Molokai sometimes did speak Hawaiian. They learned it from their grandparents or from uncles, traditional teachers. Molokai is a beautiful place, Watanabe remarked. It's the old Hawaii, what's left of it. Watanabe changed the subject. Do you know a gentleman named Marcos Rodriguez? Michele looked blank. No. How about Willie Fong, a lawyer up north of the freeway? Watanabe did not mention they were dead. Michele picked it up anyway. Sure. He squinted, looked puzzled. The guys who got stabbed, right? Yes, in Fong's office. Fong, Rodriguez, and another man still unidentified. Michele seemed confused. He spread his hands out and said, What am I missing, Lieutenant? I don't know. Watanabe watched Michele to see his reaction to that. Michele seemed surprised and irritated, but he stayed calm. Watanabe was pleased to see that the security chief fidgeted in his chair. He's nervous, Watanabe thought. What I know about those murders, Don Michele went on, is what I saw on the news. What makes you think they were murders? It's what they said on the news, Michele paused. Actually, they said it was suicide, Watanabe said. Did you think it was murder? Michele didn't take it casually. Lieutenant, is there some reason why you want to talk to me about this? Fong or Rodriguez weren't doing any work for Nanjing, were they? Are you kidding? Nanjing would never hire losers like that, Michele answered. Don Michele knew very well what had happened to Fong and Rodriguez. 19 security bots had disappeared on the night of the break-in. They had swarmed onto an intruder, cut into his body, and circulated in the man's bloodstream, slicing open arteries from the inside. But the bots weren't supposed to do this. They weren't programmed to kill anybody. They were supposed to photograph the intruder and cut the skin lightly, making the intruder bleed and thus leave a blood trace behind. And they were supposed to trigger a silent alarm. That was all. Nothing dangerous. Certainly not lethal. but somebody had programmed the bots to kill. Then Drake did it, Michele thought. The bots had sliced the intruder to ribbons, then had cut their way out of the man's body and jumped from that man to the next man like fleas. Bloodthirsty, lethal fleas. A burglar and his friends had gotten themselves killed. Accidents happen more often to assholes. But what did this detective know? Michele wasn't sure, and it made him nervous. He decided to get tough. He leaned forward and put his voice into official mode and said, "Is this company or any of its employees the subject of a criminal investigation?" Watanabe let a significant silence elapse. "No," he finally answered. "Not at this time." "I'm glad to hear that, Lieutenant, because this company is highly ethical. The founder, Vincent Drake, is known for putting his own money into cures for orphan diseases. Diseases that nobody else bothers to cure, because they aren't profitable. Mr. Drake is a good man, who puts his heart where his money is." Lieutenant Dan Watanabe listened to this with a neutral face. "You mean he puts his money where his heart is?" "That's what I said," Michele answered, gazing back at Watanabe. Watanabe placed his card on the security man's desk and wrote a phone number on it with his pen. "That's my cell. Call it any time if anything comes up. I think Mr. Drake is expecting me." Then Drake sat behind his desk, leaning back in an executive chair. An oriental rug covered the floor, an antique. The air held a pleasant aroma of cigar. Given the pleasance of the aroma, Watanabe concluded that the cigar had cost more than $10. The office had no windows, soft panel lighting. He noticed through a side door a private bathroom with marble fixtures. Interesting to see that inside a warehouse. The guy took care of himself. "We are very distressed by the recent events," Drake said. "We've been hoping you could help us." "We are doing our best," Watanabe said. "I just wanted to get more background on the disappearances." "Sure." Watanabe had been enjoying the portrait of Drake on the wall behind him. It wasn't bad. Maybe a little pretentious, but lively. "Can you tell me what your company does?" "Basically, we make small robots and use them to explore nature as a way of discovering new drugs to save human lives." "How small?" Drake shrugged and put his thumb and forefinger half an inch apart. Watanabe squinted. "You mean half an inch, like the size of a peanut?" "Maybe a little smaller," Drake answered. "How much smaller?" "Somewhat. 1 millimeter, say?" Drake gave a crisp smile. "That's barely feasible." "But have you done it?" "Done what?" "Made robots 1 millimeter in size." "We're getting into proprietary areas." Drake leaned back. "Have you had any industrial accidents with your robots?" "Accidents?" Drake frowned, and then broke into a chuckle. "Yes, frequently." "Anybody gets hurt?" "It's the other way around," Drake laughed. People stepped on the robots by accident. The robots always lose. He sighed and looked at his watch. I have a meeting. Sure, just one thing, Watanabe would describe what he'd seen in the microscope, but he would not show Driggs a photograph of the device, because a photo was evidence. And you don't flash evidence. So he kept things vague. We've become aware of a device, pretty small, that appears to have what might be a propeller and cutting blades. It might be able to fly or swim in somebody's bloodstream. Is this a Nanogen product? Drake took a moment to reply. Watanabe thought the moment lasted a bit too long. No, Drake answered. We don't make robots like that. Does anybody make them? Drake gave Watanabe a careful look. Where was this cup going? I think you're describing a theoretical device. What kind? Well, it would be a surgical micro-robot. A what? A surgical microbot. Also called a surgibot. It's a very small robot used for medical procedures. In theory, a surgibot could be made small enough to circulate in a patient's bloodstream. Equipped with scalpels, a swarm of surgibots could perform microsurgery. They could be injected into the patient, and the surgibots would swim through the bloodstream to the target's tissue. Surgibots could cut arterial plaques from the inside of an artery, for example, or a swarm of surgibots could hunt down metastasized cancer cells. The surgibots would kill the cancer cells one at a time, thus defeating the cancer. But as of now, surgibots are a dream, not a reality. So you're not actually building these, what you call surgibots? Not like that, no. I'm sorry, I don't understand, Watanabe said. Drake sighed. We are getting into an area that's very sensitive. Why? Nanogen is doing research for you. For me, Watanabe said, looking mystified. You pay taxes, sure. Nanogen is working for you. Oh, so you're doing government. We can't go there, Lieutenant. They were doing secret government work, classified, something with small robots. Drake was warning him off, hinting he'd have trouble with the government if he pursued this. Fine. Abruptly, Watanabe changed gears. Why did your vice president jump off his boat? What? What do you mean? Eric Jansen was an experienced boater. He knew to stay with his boat even in surf. He jumped into the surf for a reason. Why did he jump? Drake stood up, his face flushed. I have no idea what you're getting at. We've asked you to find our missing students. You haven't found anybody. We've lost 2 key executives. You haven't given us a damn bit of help there either. Watanabe stood up. Sir, we did find Miss Bender. We are still looking for Eric Jansen. He took out his wallet and nudged out his business card. Drake took the card and sighed as he looked at it. and an unpleasant expression flitted across his face. To be frank, we are disappointed with the Honolulu police. He let the card flutter down to his desk. One wonders what you actually do. Well, sir, the Honolulu Police Department is older than the New York Police Department. I didn't know if you knew that. We'll just keep working our cases like we always do, sir. We've got 5 more of them. Dorothy Gutt laid the photographs out for Watanabe on a lab bench. They showed the same devices, each with a propeller inside a housing and a gooseneck with blades. I found them in the Asian John Doe. A smelly job. How did you find them, Dorothy? They're really small. Dorothy Gutt flashed him a cool smile of triumph and opened a drawer and held up a heavy object. It was an industrial horseshoe magnet. I striped it over the runes. Darn thing is heavy. She put the magnet aside, then showed him a blow-up photo of one of the robots. The bot had been split cleanly, in a perfect cutaway view. Incredibly small chips and circuitry were visible, and something that looked like a battery, a driveshaft, gears. This thing is cut perfectly in half. How did you do that, Dorothy? It was simple. I mounted it in an epoxy block, just like a tissue sample. Then I sliced it with a microtome. Same thing you do with tissue samples. Dorothy's microtome, with an ultra-sharp blade, had split the microbot right down the middle. Note this feature, Dan. He bent over the photo and followed her finger to a box-like object in the guts of the robot. A small lowercase n was printed on the box. So, he said, the CEO lied to me. He wanted to slap Dorothy on the back, but stopped himself at the last moment. Dorothy Gutt didn't seem like a person who would welcome the gesture. Instead, he offered her a slight nod of the head in the Japanese mode of respect, a family habit. Excellent work, Dorothy. Humph, she snorted. Her work was never anything but excellent. Chapter 36, Tantalus Crater, 31 October, 1 o'clock p.m. Motherfucking nature, Danny muttered. It's nothing but monsters with insatiable appetites. He was trudging along, dragging his grass-covered feet and holding his swollen arm protectively. His arm seemed to have gotten even bigger, to the point where his shirt sleeve was beginning to show small rips and tears. Rick Hunter and Ken King walked along next to Danny. Rick rang the backpack, Karen holding a machete, bared and ready for action. They were the last 3 survivors. They were stumbling across a vast, curving sweep of land, covered with sand and gravel. It was the lip of Tantalus Crater. The open land extended to a bushy line of bamboo in the distance, towering to an immense height. Through a gap in the bamboo, a a boulder the size of a mountain looked, moss-covered and furrowed with gullies. The boulder seemed to be miles distant, at least for people of their size. The sun beat down on them. No rain had passed over Tantalus in many hours. They were getting very thirsty. Their small bodies lost moisture fast. Karen felt exposed. They were targets, and motioned across a wasteland without cover. A bird passed overhead, and she cringed and clutched her machete. But it wasn't a mana, it was a hawk circling over Tantalus, and the humans were too small to make a decent meal for a hawk. Or so she hoped. "Are you okay, Karen?" Rick asked. "Stop worrying about me, but I'm fine. Check on Danny. He looks bad." Danny had sat down on a stone and seemed unable to keep going. He was fondling his bad arm, adjusting the sling, and his face had gone right. "You okay, man?" "What's the meaning of that question? How's your arm?" "There's nothing wrong." But now Danny was staring at his arm. A muscle in his arm spasmed, tensing against the cloth, relaxing, tensing again. It looked involuntary. Danny seemed to have lost control of the muscles. "Why is it doing that?" Rick asked, as the spasms moved in corrugated waves along Danny's arm. The arm seemed to have a life of its own. "It's not doing anything," Danny insisted. But Danny is jerking. "No," Danny shouted, pushing him away, and he picked up his arm and moved it out of Rick's reach, cradling it with his good hand and turning his back to Rick, as if he were guarding a football. Rick began to suspect that Danny had lost all motor control of his arm. "Are you able to move your arm?" "I just did." Suddenly, there was a tearing, splitting sound. Danny started moaning. No, no. His shirt sleeve was finally coming apart. As the sleeve split, it revealed a horrible sight. The skin had become translucent, like oiled parchment. Beneath the skin, fast white ovoids rested, twitching slightly. They had a contented look. "The wasp laid eggs," Rick said. "It was a parasite." "No," Denny screamed. The eggs had hatched into larvae, grubs. They'd been feeding on the tissue in his arm. Danny stared at his arm, holding it and moaning. The popping sounds in his arm, those were the eggs hatching. The grubs were digging, chewing through his arm. He whimpered and began screaming. "They'll hatch." Rick tried to calm him. "We'll get you medical help. We're nearly at Tantalus. I'm dying. They won't kill you. They're parasites. They want to keep you alive. Why? So they can keep feeding. Oh God, oh God." Karen picked him up. "Come on. You gotta keep moving." They resumed walking, but Denny was slowing them down. He kept stumbling and sitting down. He couldn't take his eyes off his arm, as if the grubs had hypnotized him. Halfway across the ground, They came to a round tube made of blobs of clay stuck together. The tube emerged from the ground like a bent chimney. Karen said, "I wish Erica was here. She might have been able to tell us what made it." They had to assume the mud chimney held something dangerous. Probably some kind of insect. They gave the chimney a wide berth, ready to dash for cover if anything moved. As they passed it, the great boulder drew closer. She was a mother, like a butterfly. She drank only the nectar of flowers for her sustenance. Even so, she was a predator. She hunted for her babies. They lived on meat like all predators. She was intelligent, capable of learning with an excellent memory. In fact, she had 9 brains. They consisted of 1 master brain and 8 minor brains, strung out along her spinal cord like beads on a string. Among insects, she was one of the smartest. She had mated once with her husband, who had dropped dead after having sex with her. She was a crane, who lived her entire life in isolation. She was a solitary wasp. She emerged from her chimney and looked at the sun. Her head came out first, followed by her body. Her wings normally lay folded and flat across her back, like a folded fan. She unfolded her wings and vibrated them, letting her muscles warm up in the sunlight. As the wasp climbed out of the chimney, the humans froze. She was truly enormous, with a jointed abdomen splashed with yellow and black stripes. The wasp unfolded its ring and beat them, thundering, and took off into the air. Its legs dangling beneath it. "Get down! Lie flat!" The humans threw themselves to the ground and began crawling toward whatever sort of cover they could find. Scraps of grass, pebbles. The wasp didn't notice the humans at first, after she launched herself from her chimney. However, she began flying in a zigzag pattern, orienting herself for hunting flight. During the orientation phase, she looked down at the ground, inspecting every detail. She kept a precise map of the terrain fixed in her memory. She saw something new. 3 objects occupied the ground at the southeast quadrant away from her chimney. The objects were alive. They were crawling across the ground. They looked like prey. She immediately changed her flight path and swooped in. The wasp turned and dove down very fast. It chose Rick Hutter and landed on him. He rolled over on his back, waving his machete, while the wasp straddled him with her legs. Her wings beat over him. She caught him lightly in her mandibles. "Rick!" Karen shouted, running toward him, machete raised. He couldn't breathe. The mandibles had driven the air out of his chest, but somehow they didn't cut through him. The wasp was being gentle. Then she curled her abdomen underneath her and brought her sting forward, aimed at Rick. Armor plates at the jointed tip of her abdomen pulled apart, and two soft fingers covered with sensory hairs emerged, waving and wagging. Those soft fingers were the sting palps. The palps dabbled over Hutter's neck and face, tasting his skin. She liked what she tasted. The sting happened very fast. Two stingers inside a sheath emerged from a hole beneath the taste palps. As the sheath drilled into Rick just under his armpit, the stingers lanced into him. First one and then the other, sliding back and forth in tandem as they worked inward. Rick felt the needles go into him. The pain was extraordinary. He gasped. Karen threw herself at the wasp, her machete swinging, but she landed too late. The wasp went airborne, carrying Rick gripped in her legs. Karen saw him, kicking his legs, but then his body went limp. The wasp landed on the chimney, then pushed Rick inside down the shaft of the chimney, butting him forward using her head. She went down the chimney after Rick. The striped abdomen disappeared down the chimney, the sting going down last. Huddled in the sandy area, Karen and Danny debated what to do. Rick's dead, Danny Minot said. How do you know? Karen King said. Danny rolled his eyes. She wished desperately for Erica Mole. Erica might have information about the wasp. He could still be alive. Danny just groaned. She racked her brain, trying to remember what she'd learned about wasps in Entomology 101. That was a solitary wasp, I think. So what? Let's go, please. Wait. That college class she'd taken on insects. Solitary wasps. They're female, of course. They build a nest for the young. They paralyze their prey, I think. But they don't kill their prey. They feed it to their young. She had no clue as to the exact species of wasp she was dealing with, or how it really lived. Come on, Danny got to his feet and began walking away. Karen unsheathed her machete. What are you doing? Danny said. Rick saved my life, Karen said. You're insane. She didn't answer. She pulled the sharpening stone from her belt and drew it across the blade of her machete. That bitch has Rick. No, Karen, don't. Karen ignored Danny. She opened the pack and took out a radio headset and a headlamp. She took out another headset and flipped it at Danny. Put that on. She stood up and rushed over to the chimney. Then she spoke on the radio. Copy me, Danny? He was lying on his stomach in the shade of a small plant. You're crazy, he shouted at her on the radio. She put her ear up to the chimney again. It was made of dried clay, and it smelled odd. Insect saliva, glue. She could feel a slow thrumming sound under her feet. The wasp's wings beating underground. There was a nest down there. The thrumming continued for a while. Then the sound began to move up to ground level, coming closer. The wasp was climbing up the chimney, out of its nest. Karen stood in the shadowed side of the chimney, trying to blend in. The wasp's head emerged as Karen flattened herself against the chimney. Two semicircular compound eyes looked at her. She felt sure she'd been noticed. But the wasp didn't react. Instead, it took off. Airborne, the wasp flew back and forth in a Z pattern, orienting itself, and then sailed off, straight into the northwest sky, aiming for distant hunting grounds of its own choosing. When the wasp had dwindled to a point and vanished, Karen took a step backward and drove her machete into the chimney, hacking at it. She bashed the chimney to pieces, breaking it down, keeping an eye toward the northwest, fearful the wasp might reappear. But the sky remained empty. She cleared away chunks of mud, and then jumped feet first into the tunnel. "Don't leave me," Danny shouted. Karen adjusted her headset and beeped him on the radio. "Can you hear me? You're going to die, Karen. I'll be left with no one. Call me if you see her." "Oh." "Clear. Over," Karen said, and snapped off. She would have to move fast, try to find Rick, and bring him out. The wasp could come back at any time. The tunnel had round walls lined with hardened clay. It trended steeply downward. Karen descended feet first, crab walking on her hands and elbows. It was tight in here. Daylight filtered in through the entrance behind her, but the light dimmed as she proceeded deeper underground. She switched on her headlamp. The tunnel smelled of something pungent, but not unpleasant. It was probably the mother's wasp pheromones, she figured. The smell came mixed with a rancid stench, which grew stronger as she went deeper underground. Suddenly, she came to a fall-off. The tunnels turned straight downward here, plunging into a vertical shaft. Claustrophobia almost choked her as she looked down it. It was a dark hole that seemed to go down into nothingness, with no apparent bottom. "Rick is down there. Just my luck," she thought. "Well, he saved my life. It's a debt I have to pay. And I don't even like the guy." She twisted her body, struggling against the tight walls of the tunnel, and sat herself at the lip of the shaft. Letting her feet dangle, she lowered herself into the hole and began descending the shaft, pressing her hands and knees against its walls to provide a friction grip. She definitely did not want to fall. If she got dredged in the shaft, she might not be able to get out. The thought of being trapped in a vertical shaft while a giant wasp descended upon her. No, don't think about it. Out in the open air, Danny Manor tore open the pack and searched it for food. He had to keep his strength up. Not that it mattered. He was dead anyway. He took off his radio headset and placed it next to him, and began inspecting the his arm. It was so horrible. The radio was talking at him. He picked it up. What? See anything? No, no. Listen, Danny. Keep a lookout. If you see the wasp, tell me, so I can get out. It's in your interest. I will. He fastened the radio on his head and propped himself up in the shade, with his back against a rock, facing northwest, where the wasp had gone. Karen reached the bottom of the chimney. It widened slightly, then made a sharp horizontal bend. She crawled around this bend, and the tunnel opened into a chamber. She flashed her headlamp around the chamber. Many tunnels, about 24 of them, radiated from the chamber in a starburst pattern. Each tunnel ran into darkness. Rick. He was in one of those tunnels, probably dead. She crawled into the tunnel. After a short distance, it ended at a wall. The wall had been built of rubble, crammed loosely into place. Plugging the tunnel, grains of sand and gravel glued with saliva, with spaces and gaps between them. She shone her headlamp into a gap in the rubble, trying to see what lay beyond. She realized the gaps in the rubble were breathing holes, because something alive was in there, past the rubble. The rubble door was a kind of stopper or plug with holes in it. Crunching, slurping sounds filtered out through the holes, along with a clicking noise. A rotting smell wafted from the holes. 2. Something hungry lived in a room beyond this rubble. Something that ate continually. Rick, she called, are you there? The clicking stopped for a moment, then resumed. There was no other response. She put her eye up to the gap and pointed her light in. It fell over a glistening surface, the color of antique ivory. The surface was creased into segments. The segments were moving past the gap, one by one. This went on for a while, like a subway car moving past an opening. She could hear breathing, but it wasn't human. What frightened her was the size of the thing in there. It seemed as big as a walrus. There were many more tunnels to investigate. She crawled back into the main chamber and headed into the next tunnel, and tried to see through the blockage of stone and dried mud that clogged it. Rick, she shouted, can you hear me? Danny Manott's voice came over her headset, faint and crackly, because she was so far underground. What's happening? He said. I reached a large chamber. The chamber breaks into at least 20 tunnels going off in all directions. Each tunnel leads to a cell. There's a larvae in each cell, I think. She racked at a rubble door with a machete and began chopping through mud glue. Rick, she shouted, are you in there? Maybe he can hear me, but he can't talk. Or maybe he's dead. Maybe I need to get out of here. Just give this a try. She hacked out the wall, enlarging the opening until she could get her body through it. And she crawled into the cell. The cell held a wasp grub, larger than she was, an obese blob that hissed, breathing heavily, with a blind, eyeless head. Its mouth was bracketed by twin black cutting fangs. The mother wasp had provisioned the cell with food for her infant. There were two caterpillars, a koa bug, and a miserable-looking spider. At that moment, the wasp grub was feeding on the koa bug, an insect with a shiny green carapace. The room was strewn with broken pieces of insect armor, striped of flesh. There was also 3 whole heads of insects, uneaten and reeking of decay. Karen edged her way into the cell, keeping away from the grub's wicked-looking mouthparts. It was busy rooting into the koa bug. She listened. She heard whispers of air moving through the holes in the exoskeletons of the food items. Good. This meant the food was paralyzed, but was still alive. So Rick could be alive. As for the paralyzed spider, its abdomen rose and fell as it breathed, but otherwise it remained deathly still. Its 8 eyes glazed over. The grub shook its head, yanking strings of koa bug meat in its mandibles, and it sucked the flesh down like spaghetti. The koa bug was breathing too. Karen resisted an impulse to stab the larva. She wanted to kill the horrible thing, but she pulled back. The wasp grub was a part of nature. This was no more evil than a lion cub eating meat provided by a lioness. Wasps were the lions of the insect world. They did good things. They kept populations of plant-eating insects in check, just the way lions kept an ecosystem healthy. Even so, Karen did not like the idea of a wasp eating Rick. She crawled out of the cell and made her way into the next tunnel. She shouted into the breathing hole, then cut it open and went into the cell. Here she found a mature grub polishing off its last caterpillar, having eaten everything else. "Rick," she shouted. The soil deadened her voice. He could be anywhere around here. Above, below, off to the side, hidden inside a cell. Her head crackled. "What's happening, Danny?" "I can't find Rick. This place is a maze." She broke into another cell. It contained a cocoon spun of silk. An unborn wasp, visible through the silk, curled up tight, soon to break out of the cocoon as an adult. As the light played over the cocoon, the wasp shivered. She got out of there and jammed rocks back into the door. That was the last thing she needed. A newborn wasp wandering around in here, armed with a stinger, no doubt. "Rick, it's me, Karen," she shouted. She held her breath and listened. No sound reached her ears, except the chewing of the grubs and the beating of her very frightened human heart. Rick Hutter lay inside a cell in total darkness, unable to move or speak. The sting had paralyzed him, but he possessed all his senses. He could feel lumps in the dirt, floor, pressing into his back and legs. He could smell rotting insect flesh. He could not see the grub that lived in the chamber, but he could hear it perfectly. It was eating something, making crunching, sucking noises. His breathing went on normally. He could blink his eyes when he wanted to. He could do that much by his own will. He tried to move one finger and wasn't sure if the finger was moving or not. He couldn't tell. Help! Somebody help me! It was just a thought. He realized that the wasp's venom had paralyzed only part of his nervous system. The sympathetic nerves. The nerves that are controlled by conscious will. His autonomous nervous system, the conscious part, continued to function normally. His heart was beating. He was breathing fine. All systems go. But he couldn't will his body to do anything. His body was like an engine stuck in idle. He couldn't seem to find the controls or press the accelerator. Something hurt, and for a little while he didn't know what it was, until warmth spread underneath him as his bladder emptied automatically. He welcomed the relief. The venom was a wasp's version of refrigeration. It kept the prey alive and fresh until it was eaten. The crunching and slurping activity continued near his feet. The grub seemed to be nearly finished with its meal, because he could hear a rattling sound of broken pieces of exoskeleton being shoved around. The grub was nosing at the scraps of his meal. He could hear crackling noises, scraping sounds, so the grub had jaws. He dreaded the first touch of those jaws. He couldn't stop wondering which part of him the grub would eat first. Would it start by chewing on his face, or would it bite off his genitals first, or burrow into his abdominal cavity? Despite the horror of his situation, Rick Hutter felt strangely bored. Paralyzed in the dark, he had nothing to do except imagine his approaching death. He decided he'd better focus his mind on the things that had made him happy during his life. This might be his last chance for memories. He recalled wading into the surf at Belmar on the Jersey shore, where his family had spent a week at a motel each summer. What they could afford. His father had driven a delivery truck for a convenience store chain. He remembered standing on the driver's seat of his father's truck when he was 5 years old and telling everybody he was going to be a truck driver, just like his dad. He saw himself opening the acceptance letter from Stanford and reading it with complete disbelief. A full scholarship at Stanford. Then graduate school at Harvard, again on financial support. He saw himself in Costa Rica, interviewing an old lady, a curandera, as she brewed the healing tea from the leaves of the hematanthus tree. His mind turned to the lab, One night he had been trying to extract a compound from the hematenthus leaves. Karen had been working late, tending an experiment with her spiders. They had been alone in the room together. They had worked side by side at the lab bench, right next to each other. Without saying a word, the air thick with mutual dislike. But their hands had brushed by accident. Maybe I should have tried to hook up with Karen that night. Of course, she probably would have punched me. A dying man thinks mostly about missed sexual opportunities. Who says that anyway? It might really be true. He began to feel sleepy, drifting off. Rick. Her voice woke him up. It came faintly. Through the earth. I'm here, Karen, he shouted in his mind. But he couldn't make his mouth move. Rick, where are you? Hurry up. There's a Hoover with the jaws in here with me. Karen's light flickered briefly, the first light he'd seen in a long time, and was gone. Total darkness swallowed him again. She had moved on. Come back, he shouted in his mind. You missed me. Silence. She had gone away. Then in the darkness, the horror of horrors arrived. Something moist and very heavy slid over his ankles, pressing his foot into the ground. It's not happening. Next, he felt the segments of the lava bumping over his legs. Bump, bump, bump. No. The segments were sliding over his stomach. Now, then sliding over his chest, squeezing the breath out of him. No, please no. The raw scrub lay on top of him now, its weight pressing down on him, suffocating him. He could feel the grub's heart beating, thumping against his chest. He heard a moist clickety-click. Those jaws were starting to work. Click, click, snip, snap, sneak. The light returned. A ray shot into the cell. It revealed the black cutter knives, flicking around a cruelly soft mouth like a pale anus, right in front of his face. Kim was shining her headlamp into the cell. She saw the scene. Oh my God, Rick, she began, hacking at the rubble in the doorway, flinging stones aside. The teeth brushed against his forehead. The grub was nosing around, looking for a soft spot to begin chewing. It tapped its teeth over his shoulder, leaving a streak of drool. He felt the teeth prick his nose, and the moist mouth brushed across his lips like a kiss, spewing out drool. It made him cough and choke automatically. Hang on. Hurry, this bastard wants to give me a hickey. She got through the opening and threw herself at the grub, kicking the grub with both feet, pushing it away from Rick's face. You leave him alone, she shouted, and thrust her machete into the grub. The grub gasped and hissed coming out of its ear holes. Karen pulled out the blade and raised the machete, and strung it, beheading the grub in one blow. The blob-like head slopped away while the decapitated body went into a spasm. It began ripping back and forth, and reversion ceased. Karen continued to stab and, slash at the beheaded grub. But that only seemed to intensify its thrashing. She got her arms around Rick and dragged him out of the chamber, leaving the headless grub thumping the walls. A strange odor chased them. "That's bad," Hatter said silently. "That's an alarm pheromone." King realized it too. The dying larva was screaming for help, wailing for its mother in the language of scent. The scent was filling the nest. If the mother detected it, Danny's voice came on. "What's going on?" "I have Rick. He's alive. Stand by. I'm bringing him out." Rick was like a sack of potatoes, a dead load. But his strength was incredible. She had got Rick, and she would fight to the death before she'd give him up now. Dragging him, she crawled through the big chamber, heading for the vertical shaft. Just then, Danny's voice came on her headset. "She's back."